That is correct. I am not dead. Wait, I'm supposed to start these with a joke or something. Genesis, more like Genesis. I hope everybody had a fantastic holiday season and a wonderful new year, and welcome back to, not the Plague of Frogs, but the Lamb of Odd. Yes, the name change is in full effect. I appreciate everybody's patience with that one. There were some people who were trying to find my channel and who weren't able to because of the algorithm. So hopefully now that we have something more of a unique brand name, we can actually get people finding us a little bit easier, at least when they're looking for us. Since it is the beginning of a new year, I figured this would be a good time as any to talk about a story of beginnings, or rather a lot of stories of beginnings. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit about the book of Genesis, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of videos as well. So originally this was going to be a video on the Adam and Eve story in the Old Testament of the Bible, but I realized that in order to understand the Adam and Eve story, you also have to understand the creation story of Genesis 1. You should probably understand the Cain and Abel story, which we've already done a video on. You should probably understand the Noah's Ark story. And I kind of realized, like, you know what, why don't we just do a series of videos on Genesis itself? So currently the plan right now is to do a couple of different videos on the book of Genesis because it's some of the richest pay dirt in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so today is sort of a general introduction to what the book of Genesis is and how we should approach it. And don't worry, we won't be exclusively in Genesis for the foreseeable future. I've got 12 videos planned out right now for the Genesis series, counting this one. But at the same time, my interests are so diverse that inevitably I'm going to want to make a video on something else in the meantime, just to kind of shake things up a little bit. But I really did want to just take a concerted effort and make videos on Genesis, because if we get those taken care of, and if we can get through that, then pretty much every other video we make on the Old Testament, and even a lot of the New Testament of the Bible, it's going to be a lot easier to understand. So we're putting in the work ahead of time so that down the road we can enjoy its benefits. And while we're here, Genesis is really interesting. We got Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's flood, the Ark of the Covenant. That's not right. I also have two more major projects that I want to get finished and taken care of, ideally in the first half of this year. One of them is just absolutely massive. Like, we're talking potentially a 10-hour long video. I don't know if anybody's going to want to watch that, but it's something I've been wanting to make for a long time, so that one's going to take plenty of time, understandably so. The other one is something that I am really personally interested in, and so I want to do it right because it's such a nuanced topic that it's going to take some time and effort to really try to get the point across as clearly as possible. So those two will be launching at some point. They'll be substantially longer than normal videos, but for the most part, I'm going to try to keep to a relatively consistent schedule. Try to do at least 2 videos a month for the rest of the year. At least that's the plan right now, and just hopefully keep on going. Now, before we get to talking about Genesis in particular, I wanted to take a moment and lay out my credentials because I don't think I've done that yet on this channel, so I wanted to introduce everybody, old and new, to what qualifies me to comment on Genesis. In 2023, I graduated with honors from Wheaton College's Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis program. Most of the time when people get an advanced degree in theology, they go after what's called a Master of Divinity, or an MDiv degree. And an MDiv degree is great. It prepares you for a lot of the different aspects of being a pastor or a theologian. They emphasize courses on theology, on practical theology, systematic theology, as well as pastoral care and counseling, and also biblical studies on top of all of that. The course that I pursued was not a Master of Divinity degree, rather it was a Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis. So this degree basically had a little bit of theology, no pastoral counseling, I am not ordained, but it did focus almost entirely on biblical studies, ancient languages, and understanding the texts of the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern and ancient Greco-Roman context. While it was possible to specialize in either Old or New Testament for this program, I opted to specialize in both Old and New Testament. So I have extensive training in the languages and interpretive methods for both testaments. Now, I'm not saying all of this to say that I'm smart or ask for attention or to make myself sound superior to you or anybody else who might want to comment on these stories. What I am saying, though, is that you should be careful who you absorb information from. You don't necessarily need an advanced degree in order to be right about something of this nature, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there in the world today, especially when it comes to religion, so I want to be as honest to myself and to you as possible, and to do the hard work to try to understand what these texts mean and how we should understand them. So please don't receive this as me being boastful in any way. That was not my intention. I want to make sure you know where your information is coming from. Now let's talk about the book in question itself. What the heck is Genesis? For anybody who actually might not know, Genesis is the first book of the Old Testament, and thus it's the first book of the Bible. In fact, it's the first book of the Bible in many ways. It's the first book of the Bible itself. It's the first book of the Old Testament of the Bible, which is shared by both Christian and Jewish interpreters. It is the first part of what's called the Enneatuk, that is the consistent narrative flowing from Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which scopes pretty much the entire history of the pre-exilic period of ancient Israel. It's also the first part of what's called the Pentateuch, the 5 books which begin the Bible and are also known as the Torah or Law of Moses. Now, Genesis is a very complicated document with a very complicated history, but fortunately we're actually able to divide it into 4 major sections, which make it a little bit easier to approach and understand. The first section is chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis, and this contains what's known as the primeval history. This is where we find stories of Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, and Noah's flood. Those primordial stories that take place at the beginnings of history and depict how things were in the world at the very start. Moving on from there, the book of Genesis then enters into the patriarch cycles, beginning with the Abraham cycle, moving on to the Jacob cycle, and then concluding with the Joseph cycle. Now, when I was first getting out into the world, I often faced the question, do you believe the Bible is poetry or history? And that's a great question. The thing that it's getting at is a really important question, but it's very low resolution in the way that it's being asked. It's kind of like going into a library and asking the librarian, do you have fiction or non-fiction books in this library? The answer is both, depending on where you intend to look. So what kind of book is Genesis? What genre are we reading when we open up this ancient piece of literature? Well, first of all, we have to decide to take Genesis on its own terms. The Bible itself was composed by dozens of authors over thousands of years, employing a variety of ancient literary genres, many of which don't align perfectly with our own conceptions of those genres. The ancients had a different idea of history than we do today, likewise narrative, myth, and even poetry. But even taking Genesis on its own doesn't alleviate that problem, because Genesis itself shows signs of being comprised of smaller pieces, and each one of those smaller pieces has its own genre to it as well. And so asking what kind of genre Genesis is gets real tricky really quick. That being said, Genesis does participate primarily in 2 very important ancient genres, narrative and genealogy. So when we consider narratives, we have to contend with the fact that Genesis is a singular narrative. It is one document spanning 50 chapters. It's a very long book by ancient standards. But it's a narrative comprised of smaller narratives, and those narratives are comprised of yet smaller narratives. So narrative is definitely a very important part of the book of Genesis, but we have to be very careful as we go through those narratives to understand what kind of narrative they are, and then that whole question scales upward as appropriate from there. So as we're going through the stories, we're going to ask ourselves what kind of narrative this is, what it's trying to get across to the reader. But overall, the book of Genesis does share its concern for narratives by being a narrative overall. Now, the other major genre that Genesis participates in is genealogy. Now, this is a genre that we really don't have today very much, except for in very particular circumstances. And for anybody who's read the book of Chronicles or other parts of the Bible, these are usually the parts that you skip. Essentially, it's very common in some ancient Israelite literature to simply provide a whole odd genealogy, which is literally just this person was the son of this person, who was the son of this person, who was the son of this person. They go on like that for chapters at a time. And Genesis often does as well. Very seldom in as painful detail as other parts of the Bible, like the aforementioned First Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah, but it still does participate in this idea. And yet, it often gives us genealogies through a narrative nature. In other words, Genesis as a whole, despite being a narrative, is in a sense some sort of a genealogy, telling the story of creation and everything in it, from the creation of the cosmos itself through the earliest peoples and then moving on to their descendants who were alive at the time of the contemporaries of the authors of the text. The idea of Genesis as a genealogy comes out really strongly in the patriarchal cycles, where we find family concerns front and center among the themes that those stories are trying to address. In fact, we often see the neighboring kingdoms that surrounded Israel in its own context being portrayed as the descendants of relatives of the Israelites themselves. Perhaps most famously in the story of Jacob and Esau, we find that Jacob goes on to become the father of ancient Israel, whereas his brother Esau goes on to become the father of the Edomites, a kingdom which neighbored the ancient Israelites. And it's through a discussion of Esau's attitudes and behaviors that the Israelites can comment on the Edomites themselves, and likewise commenting on themselves as Israelites through the depiction and description of Jacob in these narratives. And if that sounds confusing to you, don't worry, it is. We'll take that again piecemeal as we encounter those things. But just keep in the back of your mind that genealogies are really important to the authors of Genesis, and it's really important for understanding where people come from and how they were supposed to operate in the ancient Israelite context. Speaking of its ancient context, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the book of Genesis and other ancient stories from the ancient world, particularly the myths of the nations that were the neighbors of the ancient Israelites. So it's become pretty popular, at least on the internet lately, to say that Genesis is kind of nothing but a knockoff of the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis epic, or even the Babylonian Enuma Elish, despite the fact that the lattermost was probably composed after the Israelites really became settled and became their own thing. But it's a legitimate question. Were the ancient Israelites in the writing of Genesis influenced by other ancient myths? And people tend to respond to this in two extreme ways. If they're Christians, they'll deny that there's any sort of foreign influence on the Bible whatsoever, and especially in Genesis. People, on the other hand, who are perhaps more antagonistic towards the Bible and its contents, will say that it exclusively borrowed, in some cases, from the nations around the Israelites and from the stories around them, and so therefore it's just as useless as these other ancient narratives. Neither of these seem to be the case. The ancient world was generally a very open place. There was a lot of trade, a lot of commerce, and in some cases a lot of military conquest that led ancient cultures into contact with each other. There was never a situation where there was one culture hermetically sealed off from all of the other ones, and so it just kind of existed on its own. There was no hermit state like North Korea, and even North Korea itself is influenced by other nations today. And so as a result, we start to see cultures bleed into one another to various degrees. Obviously, there were some cultural lines that were never crossed, but at the same time, we see clothing, jewelry, pottery, weapons, and other tools and things of that nature distributed from one nation in the ancient world all across the ancient Near East. In fact, in the early dynastic period of Egypt, we're already finding Mesopotamian artifacts from the Yemdet Nasser period. These two very early and very different cultures were already coming into contact with each other and making trade in between them. And as a part of trade, you're also going to get other cultural ideas crossing over, things like food, dress, religious patterns, and yes, even stories. And so we have plenty of examples from the ancient world of one people group borrowing a story from another ancient people group. Consider, for instance, the Hittite story of Alkirnursa, which is just clearly a Canaanite story which has been given a quick Hittite gloss. This story originated in Canaan and found its way to Hittite country, where it was rewritten in Hittite and used by the Hittites. And what's interesting about this story and other examples like it is that even though you can tell that originally this wasn't a Hittite story, it has now become a Hittite story because the Hittites retold the story in such a way that emphasized Hittite cultural values instead of Canaanite cultural values, which is where the story comes from. So even though the story was adopted from one culture into another culture, doesn't necessarily mean that it's remained exactly the same, that its import is exactly the same. In fact, it's been changed in specific ways so that the receiving culture can turn into something completely new. So when we come to Genesis, which was written in this ancient world with all its trade and commerce and cultural overlap, we shouldn't be surprised if we see motifs, ideas, and even plot lines borrowed from other pieces of ancient literature. That's totally fine within a Christian view of the book of Genesis. But we also shouldn't reduce Genesis to merely those borrowings from other cultures. We should also take into consideration the fact that cultures borrowed from each other. It was very common for this to happen. Just because Genesis may derive inspiration from these other documents doesn't mean that it's reducible to those documents or to the themes that those documents discuss. In fact, when Genesis does interact with other pieces of ancient literature, it often subverts or even inverts the expectations of the source documents in order to say something else completely new in its own culture. A great example of this is in the flood story, which we'll talk more about later. But in the Israelite flood story found in Genesis, and this flood story has very important parallels to the Atrahasis epic and the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic in ancient Akkadian literature, despite the fact that Genesis has these very important and very interesting parallels with these, if Genesis did borrow from those sources, it's doing something different with those stories. In those stories, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh Tablet 12, the gods cause a flood because they're angry with humankind because they were keeping them awake at night. The gods couldn't sleep, Enlil in particular. And yet in the Genesis version, in the Israelite retelling of the narrative, it wasn't that humankind had annoyed the divine realm, but rather that human violence had made them so evil that God regretted making humankind in the first place and needed to start over from scratch. You could say that one story was adopted into the other, but at the same time, you can't really say that the effect of the story or the thing it's trying to say is exactly the same. Changes in the same story are very important, and they change the way that the story was meant to be read. Genesis is no exception. A modern example of what I'm talking about when it comes to taking a story from one culture and making modifications to it as it comes into another culture would be the way that a lot of modern writers like to riff on or even directly copy ancient Greek myths. Anybody who read the Percy Jackson novels or saw the movies, which I only ever saw the one movie, so that's all I'm basing this off of, will see that this is clearly based on Greek mythology. That's the idea here. But it's been very Americanized. Ideas of Greek culture or Greek emphasis in Greek literature are gone, and we only find aspects of American ideas and American ideals being expressed through these stories. So just because these novels take themes from ancient Greek literature and sometimes even sets events in the time of the ancient Greeks, nevertheless, they're fundamentally American pieces of literature. They focus on current American problems and desires and ideals rather than ancient Greek problems, desires, and ideals. So just because a story is retold in a new setting doesn't mean it's the same story. We'll discuss the parallels with ancient literature whenever they come up in the appropriate video for talking about a certain topic. Having talked about genre and Genesis's interaction with ancient literature in the surrounding area, I want to talk a little bit about what Genesis is about. Although this is a compilation of originally independent stories, can we say that Genesis is about any particular theme? Yes, we kind of can, actually. If I had to pick two themes that Genesis is definitely focused on or about, I would have to say that these are family and covenant. It's been noted for a long time that the primary structuring element in the book of Genesis are what are known as the Toledot formula. Toledot simply means generations of something. So basically, every once in a while in the book of Genesis, the narrative will pause and a genealogical section will begin saying, these are the generations of so-and-so. Usually it provides a genealogy at that point and then moves on to discuss those characters in the course of the story. When it says, these are the generations of, the Hebrew word there is Toledot. And so Toledot is typically understood to be the structuring element in the book of Genesis. Now, interestingly, although Genesis is part 1 of 5 of the ancient Pentateuch and part 1 of 9 in the ancient Enneateuch, the Toledot formula stops with Genesis. Once Genesis is done, the Toledot formula is complete. So it seems that whatever is at the end of Genesis is the end goal of what the Toledot are driving us towards. Just a fun little structural and lexical quality. The other important aspect that Genesis really heavily focuses on is the idea of covenant. In Genesis 1 through 11, the primeval history, we see primarily stories about problematic relationships between humankind and the things that interact with human beings, be it other human beings, the natural world around them, and most importantly, God. And a lot of the stories in the primeval history of Genesis are about the breakdown of relationships. The Adam and Eve story depicts the breakdown of relationship between humankind and God, and between husband and wife. The Cain and Abel story shows the breakdown between brother on the one hand and brother on the other, and such stories continue all the way through the primeval history. So we see the breakdown from God's ideal state as established in the creation stories into this sort of degrading sense of relationship between humankind and themselves and between humankind and God. And this is where the concept of the covenant shows up. The covenant is first alluded to in Genesis 12, immediately after the primeval history, and it comes out most strongly in Genesis 15 and 17, both part of the Abraham cycle. Essentially, the covenant is a contract between God and specific members of humankind, the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the covenant basically reestablishes God's relationship with humankind and ultimately aims at restoring the relationships between all human beings and one another. So basically, Genesis 1 through 11, the primeval history, sets up the problem. It depicts the breakdown of relationships between humankind and themselves and humankind and God. And then the rest of the book of Genesis, which is 39 chapters of it through the patriarchal cycles, depicts the restoration or the beginning of the restoration of that relationship through the covenant. And again, the covenant is the agreement between God and a specific group of human beings. And that's about all I have to say as an introduction to Genesis as a whole. I'm really looking forward to digging into this with everybody. Hope everyone had a fantastic holiday season. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time on The Lamb of Odd.